Hi, Dr. J. Franklin Schultz here with you again for video number 5 in a discussion about police reform and law enforcement in modern America. I want to talk today about racism. Um, I'm not here to deny that there is racism that is exhibited in individuals and sometimes organizations throughout the culture, whether it's just the economics or government or whatever. But here's the mistake that the anti-police elements are making in terms of dealing with racism in America. If we want to concentrate on American policing and say that that is the source of America's racism, uh, then those who are really concerned about Black lives will take a much broader view and recognize that solving problems that may exist in policing, and if they're there, they need to be examined, find out what the origins are, find out a solution to it so that everybody can be treated equitably. I have no argument with that whatsoever. But I want to show you something that's going to aggravate some, because it's going to look like, and we can't talk about this because of the emotions around the discussion. But when I talk about the intra-racial homicide rate involving Blacks killing Blacks, then people say, oh, that's a diversion. You're trying to blame Blacks for being inherently violent, that I don't recognize the influences that result in criminality among some segments of any population. The only thing I'm going to say here is that when we look at this particular statistic, and I would draw your attention to the fact that we have in this particular year, 2018, which in terms of UCR information is very up to date. 2,925 victims of homicide that were categorized as Black, compared to 3,315 victims of homicide that were categorized as white. Now, you understand that these numbers statistically are pretty close to equal when we know that this represents 15% of the population and shouldn't represent 45% of homicides. Now, we know that crime typically is intra-racial, so that of the 3,300 white homicide victims, 2,677 were killed by white perpetrators. In the African-American totals, almost 3,000, those were committed by 2,600 Blacks. So in other words, whites kill whites, Blacks kill Blacks. And that's true throughout the spectrum of demographics of murder statistics. But here's something unique about murder. First of all, it's pretty reliably reported. And secondly, these offenders are not offenders who were selectively picked out by police. In other words, there's no way that this could be profiling. Whether they were differentially treated is a good question for research, but these are accurate records that reflect the reality of homicide and are largely apart from any influence of the police responding differentially. What we do know is that when policing is restricted, such as in many cities throughout the country today with the defunding and the diversion and the hands-off policies that prosecutors and police chiefs and politicians are creating, is that homicide rates are going to go up, and that means that more Black lives are going to be killed. I did a little math, which I haven't done recently, but I'm assuming that if someone lays horizontal, that they represent about 10 inches in height. And I took the just about 3,000 Black homicide victims. In fact, let's just take that down to 2,500 that were known to be killed by a Black perpetrator, and assigned 10 inches to each one of those. The bodies literally in any one year will stack up to the observation deck of the Empire State Building. This, my friends, is something that deserves attention. If there's anything that deserves marches, if there's anything that deserves reform, if there's anything that deserves funding, if there's anything that deserves legislative attention, if there's anything that deserves burning down buildings and looting stores to bring attention, it should be these 3,000 lives that were taken by members of their own race so disproportionately in terms of the total number of victims compared to any other demographic in America. So let me just talk about the possibility of the differential treatment of Black Americans compared to other demographic groups. Let's start with the pregnant Black mother and think about, first of all, the fact that in New York City, more Black unborn babies were aborted than were born alive. Now, if that doesn't smack somehow of some type of racial selectivity and targeting, I think the math kind of speaks for itself. So that's very distressing. And what does that represent? Does that represent an anti-Black attitude towards medical providers, towards people that are proponents of abortion? I don't know. I'm not trying to answer any of those questions. I'm trying to ask these questions. So if we say that 25% of persons under the poverty line are Black compared to 10% of people under the poverty line that are white, and I pulled that off those are statistics not just made out of my head, then is that unborn Black child going to be treated differently in terms of prenatal health care, in terms of child care, in terms of having a two-parent family? And again, people get all hackled because, hey, how dare you define a family? I'm just telling you that the common denominator of people in prison is not race, it's fatherlessness. I also want to point to the Great Society programs of the 1960s. We've had welfare since the Depression era, but the Great Society programs that began in the 60s started to literally subsidized by financial payments, fatherless homes. If you look before 1960, you'll see that Black families were very healthy in terms of being intact and having a traditional unified family. Now, you can build your family any way you want. I'm not trying to debate that. I'm just saying there is a relationship between fatherlessness and criminal activity, and there is a statistical relationship between government programs that subsidize fatherlessness and fatherlessness. So that's just with an unborn child. Then do they get this? Do they get adequate housing? Do they get adequate nutrition? Do they get the same educational opportunities? Do their parents have the same employment opportunities? Does government assistance put a cap on individual earnings and property ownership? We recognize that for generations, Black families did not have generational wealth to pass down because they were not allowed to own property in many ways. We bought a house in Missouri that was built in the 1960s, and the original deed included a now illegal component that said that you promise that you won't sell to a Negro family. So it's that recent that this deprivation of privacy, of property, and therefore generational wealth has been present in American society. Sad to say, I'm just talking about the reality of what people are calling systemic racism. Then you look at all the panoply of restricted access, of the absence of what many are calling white privilege. And I understand white privilege to be the fact that race has never been an impediment to me. Doesn't mean that I had it easy, grew up poor, parents grew up poor. I can talk about that, but I will say that my race has never been an impediment to whatever I wanted to achieve, and that's not true in the life of Black Americans. So what I'm saying is, if we spend a lot of our effort on trying to stamp out racism in policing, to the ignoring of medical care, housing, nutrition, economic opportunity, property ownership, government programs, then we're really aiming at the wrong target. Doesn't mean we don't have work to do, not saying that at all. I'm just saying that you're wasting time if you're spending all of your time blaming policing for the racial inequities in America. I hope that's good fodder for discussion. Thank you for visiting with me, and hopefully we'll see you again soon for video number 6 about policing in America.